Good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jim Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the Western National Parks Association. Thank you for coming tonight. What an honor it is to welcome you to the very first of our first lecture series of what we hope to be an annual lecture series. We envision this annual series as an opportunity to help celebrate the legacy of Dr. Haury and connect new audiences to him in the science of archaeology. Western National Parks Association is an educational partner, nonprofit educational partner of the National Park Service. We create programs and publications and services to 67 national parks in 12 western states, and we're anchored here. Our headquarters is here in Tucson, Arizona. And to tell you just a little bit more about our organization, I'd like to show you a very, very brief film. If you're interested in learning more about WNPA, please look for me after the event, and I also point you to this table here where we have a lot of materials for you to take home. We invite you to participate in our many, many events. We have some wonderful educational tours ongoing, so please look us up. I want to thank our partners for this presentation this evening and this series. First of all, the Arizona State Museum. Thank you, Director Patrick Lyons, for your support. Patrick is here tonight. Also, thank you, Mike Jacobs, curator of the collections, and for pulling some of the artifacts for tonight that you can see in the back. Also, from the State Museum, thank you, Janelle Weekly, curator of photography. Many of the photographs you'll see in the presentation this evening. Also, thank you, U of A School of Anthropology and Chair Diane Austin for your sponsorship. Finally, I'd like to thank and recognize the Southwestern Foundation and its director, Dion Brett Hart, who's here tonight. Thank you, Dion, for your support. The relationship between WNPA and Dr. Haury and the Haury family runs very deep. I mentioned that Dr. Haury was a founding board member of our organization, Western National Parks Association, in 1938. Dr. Haury's stewardship as a board member was a particularly important role as we developed publications for the visiting public to these national parks. His role as a steward, overseeing the publications of hundreds and hundreds of publications, many of which are free to the public, and also sales items at our park stores. In 1984, WNPA created the Emil Haury Award, where we recognize those individuals who make outstanding contributions to research in our national parks and monuments. And the legacy continues. The Haury family remains involved in our organization. Lauren, Jan, wife, and Eric's son have remained involved in our organization, and we're very, very grateful for that involvement. Lauren Haury, as I know you all know, is a noted oceanographer and has an amazing career in his own right. I encourage all of you to Google Lauren Haury oral history, and you will find this wonderful narrative that was created by the Scripps Institution for Oceanography and its archives. So do that. You'll learn a lot of wonderful stories about Lauren. I've really enjoyed getting to know Lauren and his family, and it is with my distinct pleasure that I get to introduce Lauren Haury, who will then introduce our very special speaker tonight, Lauren Haury.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And unlike Ray Thompson, I have to come here plugged in to my external memory. It's a great personal privilege and pleasure to introduce Ray Thompson as the first speaker in this series of lectures honoring my father, Emil W. Haury. Sorry. Can you hear me in the back? Is that better? I'm not speaking into it. On behalf of all the Haury family, I want to thank the Western National Parks Association, the University of Arizona, the Department of Anthropology, and the Arizona State Museum, and the Southwest Center for making this all happen. And I especially want to thank, on behalf of my older brother Alan, who lives in Maine, and he regrets being unable to be here tonight. Our father's career spanned a wide range of disciplines and activities, many of which merit a full lecture on each subject. We can think of no one better than Ray Thompson to present a comprehensive introduction and overview to his life and work. Introducing Ray is really very special to me because I'm proud to have him as one of my oldest friends. He turned 90 this year, and I have known him for almost 70 years. I first met Ray in the summer of 1947 when I was 7 years old, and Ray was an undergraduate at Tufts University. He came west to attend the University of Arizona Archaeological Field School at Point of Pines, which is east of Globe, Arizona, and I was there with my family that summer and for many summers. It was there that he met his future wife, Molly Kendall, an Arizona rancher's daughter, who was working for my father in the anthro department and was at Point of Pines that summer on the staff at Point of Pines. And Molly passed away early this year, and we all greatly regret that she's not able to be at this event this evening. Since that summer, Ray and Molly's path have been always closely tied to Dad and the University of Arizona and both the Department of Anthropology and the Arizona State Museum. And I'd like to present just a very brief chronology of this association filled out by a few personal observations. Ray was at Point of Pines 9 summers between 1947 and 1960, almost as many summers as Dad. First as a student, then as dig foreman, then as assistant director, and then director. His experience in the Navy Construction Battalion in the Western Pacific during World War II was especially valuable in the building and maintaining of the field school and lots of other places as well, and I was very impressed by that as a kid. My earliest memory of Ray from those days is of him being the only one smart enough to always completely cover himself and protect himself from the rays of the sun. He'd wear a hat and a bandana over his neck, long sleeve shirt, long pants. Everybody else was running around without a shirt. Ray joined the anthro department in 1956 when he replaced my father-in-law to be, Ned Danson, as professor of archaeology. And when my father retired in 1965, Ray succeeded him as department chair and director of the Arizona State Museum and skillfully managed a blossoming department and museum. He stepped down as head of the department in 1980, but remained as museum director until he officially retired in 1997. So you can see that Ray's career has mirrored that of my father, giving him a unique perspective on Dad's life and to present the introductory lecture. And also like Dad, he never accepted what retirement is supposed to mean and has continued active research, writing, publishing, and mentoring students, graduate students. And last but not least, what makes him most qualified to present this evening's lecture is that Ray has researched and remembers more about the Haury family, origins, and history than anyone in the Haury family. So it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce to you Raymond H. Thompson.
Thank you, Lauren. I knew you were going to introduce me, but I didn't know that you were going to nominate me for sainthood. And I appreciate very much your comments, overblown though they may be. I'm honored and pleased to have this opportunity to lead you in a celebration of the life of Emil Haury. Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
But I must first stop and conform to the ethical standards of modern scholarship and disclose to you that I am an unabashed, absolute great admirer of him. Although I try to avoid using the perpendicular pronoun, a brief explanation is in order. After tour duty in the North Pacific with the U.S. Navy Seabees, I returned to the Tufts University to complete the education that had been interrupted by World War II. I applied to Haury's new field school at Point-aux-Pines. He accepted me as one of the 20 lucky students, and I spent the summer of 1947 happily confirming my boyhood desire to be an archaeologist. It was there, as Lauren pointed out, that I met the rancher's daughter, who brightened my life for 75 years. When I arrived at Point-aux-Pines, my GI Bill budget was down to the lone buffalo nickel in my pocket. At the end of the field school, Emil took me to Tucson, put me up in his house, fed me, hired me to build an exhibit on Ventana Cave in the Arizona State Museum, and greatly facilitated my pursuit of you-know-whom. At the end of the following summer, Emil played a key role in getting us married. He consoled her parents by assuring them that the impoverished graduate student who was taking their youngest daughter, Molly, away from the ranch, far away from the ranch, was somehow reliable. My sartorial condition was pretty bad at that time. I was wearing out all of the fatigues that I had gotten in the Seabees, and the only thing I had that was valuable was a pair of dress shoes, because there was no social event on my Pacific island to wear them. Therefore, Emil bought me a suit, a shirt, and a tie, drove me to Tombstone to get married on this very day, 66 years ago, and then put us on the train to Cambridge so that I could complete my graduate studies at Harvard University. Molly returned to her beloved ranch when her ashes were strewn there earlier this year. Well, Emil continued to foster my career, hired me as an assistant professor, and within a few years, as Lauren pointed out, asked me to take on the task of nurturing and expanding the anthropological program that Cummings and he had established at the University of Arizona. So I hope now that you will understand that my great admiration for Emil Haury is completely honest and above board. Emil Walter Haury, born in Newton, Kansas at the beginning of the 20th century, on the 2nd of May, 1904, was the youngest of the 4 sons of Gustav Adolf Haury and Clara Katerina Ruth. The story of his life, however, has its beginnings in the terrible loss of life in Europe during the 30 Years' War during the first part of the 17th century. Some 200 Mennonite families left the Aargau region of north-central Switzerland and settled on depopulated land in the Palatinate in southwestern Germany. At the beginning of the 19th century, many of them moved to Bavaria to farm undeveloped land on the Danube west of Ingolstadt. And by the middle of that century, however, the lack of land for the expanding population, poor economic conditions, the failure of the German Revolution of 1848, and the threat of military service caused many Mennonites to look to America. Emil's paternal grandparents, Jakob Haury and Maria Schmidt, migrated to Iowa, where Emil's father was born. His mother was born in Illinois, where her parents, John Ruth and Elise Strom, had settled. Before long, many of the Iowa and Illinois Mennonites, including the Haury families and the Ruth family, moved to east central Kansas, where Gustav and Clara were married on 11 June 1891. 2 years later, Gustav became one of the founding faculty members of Bethel College, the oldest Mennonite institution of higher learning in the country, along with Peter John Wadle, the father of Waldo, Emil's boyhood friend, who became an authority on the archaeology of the Great Plains, and Heinrich Daniel Penner, who later would become Emil's father-in-law. Emil and his brothers grew up on the campus of Bethel College, in the modest comfortable, orderly, and academic environment provided by his liberal and supportive parents. It was there that Emil learned the traditional values of hard work and industriousness, integrity and honesty, cleanliness and simplicity of living, personal loyalty and commitment, cooperation and community service, and compassion and help for others, all values to which he subscribed throughout his long life. Emil and Waldo roamed the nearby fields and woods, exploring the archaeological treasures of Sand Creek, that legendary incubator of the archaeological careers of both of them. If Emil were here today, he would remind us that Bethel College and the University of Arizona produced a third archaeologist, Roland Funstein Rickert, who gave many years of public service to southwestern archaeology in the National Park Service. Well, in 1923, Emil began his freshman year at Bethel College, nurturing his desire to be an archaeologist, but wondering how in the world to make it happen. Fortunately, about that time, a former Bethel College faculty member, Emil Rickert Reason, who was teaching philosophy at the University of Arizona, learned that pioneer Arizona archaeologist Byron Cummings was planning to make a trip east to seek funding for his investigations of Cuicuilco in central Mexico. Rickert suggested that Cummings stop in Kansas and give a lecture at Bethel College on his archaeological work in Arizona. Emil attended that lecture and asked Cummings to let him take part in the following summer's explorations in Arizona. Cummings could not grant that request because he expected to be in Mexico, but he urged Emil to keep in touch. So, the following year, Emil wrote to Cummings and asked to be considered for the summer of 1925. Well, when Cummings responded that he would again be in Mexico, which he considered one of the best places to be introduced to archaeology, Gustav Haury offered to pay his son's train fare to Mexico City if Cummings would allow him to take part in the Cuicuilco project. Cummings not only agreed, but he offered to pay Emil's train fare from Mexico City to Tucson, to give him a student job in the Arizona State Museum, which would allow him to major in archaeology at the University of Arizona. Emil Haury and Clara Lee Frapps in 1927 earned the first BAs in archaeology at the University of Arizona. Emil had planned to spend the following summer furthering his romantic interests in Hulda Esther Penner, whom he had known since elementary school. Her parents, Heinrich Penner and Katharina Dalke, were among the many Mennonites who migrated to Kansas from the huge Molochna colony on the Black Sea when they lost the exemption from military service that had been granted to their ancestors by Catherine the Great in 1786. Well, Hulda was conveniently in Tucson, visiting her oldest sister, Rachel Rebecca, who was the wife of Professor Reason. However, Cummings sent Emil to northern Arizona to collect archaeological specimens for the Arizona State Museum. The summer was not a total loss, however, because Cummings invited 3 students, Emil, Clara Lee, and Florence Hawley, who had earned her BA in English, as well as Hulda, to join him attending the conference on Southwestern Archaeology that was being hosted at Pecos, New Mexico by Alfred Vincent Kidder, the nation's leading archaeologist. Well, Cummings was president of the university in 1927, so they went to Pecos in the president's Lincoln touring car with Emil as the driver. He remembered that trip as much for its many flat tires as he did for the romantic and professional benefits. He and Hulda and Clara Lee had a wonderful opportunity to observe the greats, not just of Southwest but of American archaeology at that conference. But poor Florence Hawley was not allowed to go with them because her mother did not think that the group was properly chaperoned. Cummings promised his 3 students teaching jobs if they would continue at the graduate level. This was a very important offer because the master's degree was the primary degree that most faculty members held in American colleges at that time. Well, they received the first 3 MAs in archaeology at Arizona in 1928 and began teaching that year. Their employment allowed Emil to propose to Hulda, and they were married by her father on the 7th of June, 1928. They had 2 sons, as you have already found out. Emil's first year of teaching made him acutely aware that his education was incomplete and his experience limited. An opportunity to expand his horizons came in the form of Andrew Ellicott Douglas, a professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona who was interested in sunspots and long-term climatic change, evidence for which he hoped to find in the growth records of coniferous trees. He had established a chronology of tree rings extending from the present back to 1260 and had another sequence of 585 years that was not connected to the other sequence. Emil and Lyndon Haury helped Douglas find archaeological specimens that connected these 2 sequences. On 22 June 1929, a small piece of charcoal was found at the Sholo ruin that closed the gap between the 2 sequences and allowed Douglas to date most of the big ruins in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. Emil was the first person that Douglas taught to do dendrochronology, and his year of work on the huge backlog of specimens provided the first independent test of the Douglas method. He helped Douglas teach the first course in dendrochronology, with Waldo Wadle, Clara Lee Fraps, and Florence Hawley among the students. They were all together, you can see that. Emil was one of the key figures in the development of dendrochronology, and in 1937 was one of the co-founders of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, which today is a major institution in the study of climatic change. The lab now occupies a new building, made possible by a gift of Emil's second wife, Agnes, and named after Brian Bannister, one of the Haury students who ran the laboratory during the critical years after World War II. Well, by 1931, Emil was still in search of ways to expand his archaeological experience. And he joined Harold Sterling Gladwin at the new Gila Pueblo Archaeological Foundation that Gladwin had established in Globe, Arizona. No longer interested in his financial success, Gladwin sold his seat on the New York Stock Exchange, moved to Santa Barbara, where he met Kidder and became fascinated with Southwestern archaeology. He began an ambitious program of archaeological survey and excavation. He defined problems of regional scope, and he challenged established views. But he needed a trained archaeologist to help him. Well, Emil was the obvious choice, and as assistant director of Gila Pueblo, he had an unparalleled opportunity to do field work without the distractions of academic or museum routine. Moreover, Gladwin supported Emil's desire to obtain a PhD in anthropology at Harvard University, which he received in 1934. Kidder continued to advise Gladwin and often visited Gila Pueblo, which was a boon for Emil because he considered Kidder to be his role model ever since that 1927 Pecos Conference. Now, while at Harvard, Emil was confronted with the power of the South American Indian medicine man. The Peabody Museum there had an exhibition of lowland South American ethnographic materials that included the ceremonial paraphernalia of that medicine man. Included among the many ritual items was a sort of medium-sized basket that was suspended on a single wire. Shortly before midnight, the basket would start to rotate, first in one direction and then in another. And then about 5 a.m., it would abruptly stop. Well, at first the cleaning crew was intrigued and amused by the moving basket, and they mentioned it to their supervisors just as a curiosity. After a while, though, they began to be disturbed by the sheer spookiness of it. And when one of them managed to see the label and read that the stuff had belonged to this powerful medicine man, they changed. All of a sudden, they decided that the rotating basket was an evil omen of the wrath of that medicine man, and they demanded that steps be taken to combat his baleful influence. Well, the academic staff, of course, believed none of this and considered it to be superstitious nonsense. Okay, said the directorial staff, let's have a work stoppage. So in order to avoid this crisis, the museum officials agreed that they would have someone with scientific training go to this exhibit gallery and spend the night there to see what was happening. Emil, who was intrigued by the whole thing, volunteered to do it. And of course, he observed exactly what the janitors had been reported. He also determined that there was a weak but a very constant vibration that could be felt throughout the entire building. He determined that the basket only turned in response to that weak vibration, which was produced by an electrical generating plant about a mile away on the banks of the Charles River. The vibration was transmitted to the museum through the very uniform glacial deposits that underlie most of the Boston Basin. Now, the vibration was only felt at night because the vibrations that are stronger from cars and trucks and subway trains during the daytime interrupted that weaker vibration that was felt in the nighttime. Well, museum officials accepted Emil's explanation and his recommendation that the basket be suspended on 2 wires. So the basket ceased to rotate and the janitors happily returned to their duties. Now, while at Gila Pueblo, Emil carried out field research in every region and time period of the Southwest. He surveyed many largely unknown areas, excavated numerous sites, contributed to the further development of tree ring dating, helped systematize the ceramic taxonomy, all of which he was able to share with his colleagues because Gladwin insisted on and supported prompt publication of field research. The years that Emil spent at Gila Pueblo have been labeled 7 years that reshaped Southwest prehistory. However, Gladwin had a penchant for floating weird ideas based on vague and far-flung similarities that contrasted very much with Emil's insistence that every hypothesis had to be based, at least in part, in some empirical data. So problems began to emerge in the Gladwin-Haury relationship. And once again, Cummings presented Emil with an opportunity for change and advancement. During the Depression, the legislature had reduced the University of Arizona budget so much that 6 or so of the oldest professors were forced into retirement. And by oldest, I mean in the late 70s. Cummings, therefore, was retiring as head of the Department of Archaeology, and he had anointed Emil as his successor. So in 1937, Emil replaced Cummings as head of the Department of Archaeology, and the following year as director of the Arizona State Museum. However, Cummings found it very hard to give up the important role that he had played in state and university politics for almost a quarter of a century. On the very first day of Emil's tenure as director of the State Museum, Cummings came in and told him in great detail exactly how things were to be done. Emil told me then and there that he promised himself that when he retired, he would not hang around hovering over the shoulder of his successor. He kept that promise when he turned the reins over to me in 1964, although he was always there when I asked for his valuable advice. Cummings favored a very conservative financial approach, which contrasted greatly with the advice that Emil received from his brother-in-law, Emil Reason, who had now become Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. You know, we might even speculate that the close relationship between the Haury Penner, and Reason families must have had some role to play in the selection of Emil as Cummings' successor. In any event, Emil took Reason's advice, and despite the fact that the university was suffering from those desperate Depression-era budget cuts, he started a vigorous and ultimately successful campaign to increase the budget, the size of the faculty, the library holdings, student support, and research activity. During the 43 years of his active service to the University of Arizona, he developed opportunities for field training, carried out significant research projects, created a nationally ranked doctoral program, professionalized and modernized the museum, co-founded the Laboratory for Tree Ring Research, the Bureau of Ethnic Research, now the Bureau of Applied Research in Anthropology, the Radiocarbon Age Determination Laboratory, the Arid Lands Program, and the University of Arizona Press. Well, the task of professionalizing the museum was much more difficult than the expansion of the program in anthropology. Cummings had a very modern view of the nature of anthropology, but his concept of a museum came right out of the antiquarian approach of the 19th century. Haury started by trying to clean some of the artifacts that were on the walls of the museum. He told me, well, what Cummings had done was to put Navajo blankets on the walls and plant a flat basket right in the middle of the blanket. And Emil told me that when he tried to remove those specimens to clean them, most of the textiles simply disintegrated. They had been largely eaten by colonies of insects living behind the baskets, and they were still in one place, mainly because they were sort of glued to the wall by the secretions of the insects. Emil constructed special storage fillers, established guidelines for future collecting, shifted attention from objects to the ideas they represent, and provided explanatory and interpretive labels for the new exhibits. He introduced a modern cataloging system and began to improve the care and conservation of the collections. He also set out to expand the almost non-existent museum staff. It was not until 1943, 50 years after the museum was founded, that Edwin Booth Sales, Ted Sales, became the first full-time member of the museum staff. Well, although most of the teaching faculty was full-time, museum staff members, including both Cummings and Haury, were all part-time prior to the appointment of Ted Sales. I was a grateful beneficiary of that staff expansion, for the second of those full-time employees was that rancher's daughter, who began her museum employment in 1947, the year I showed up at Point of Pines. Well, Haury recognized and took advantage of the uniqueness of the Arizona State Museum. Although it was established in 1893 as a state museum, it was also an institution in Arizona's land-grant university with its threefold mandate of teaching, research, and service. Emil was able to take advantage of the mutually reinforcing responsibilities and opportunities in this situation and to skillfully exploit them. He provided archaeological services in Arizona instead of trying to control the archaeology, as Cummings had done. He continued Cummings' efforts to protect archaeological resources from looting and indiscriminate digging. He obtained new legislation that not only protected those resources on state land, but also made them available to all qualified researchers. He modified Gladwin's archaeological survey system to a more comprehensive one that continues today to serve researchers in Arizona through the As Sites program. Instead of competing and battling with Eastern colleagues, as Cummings and Hewitt in New Mexico had done, Emil joined forces with them to establish national and international standards. Well, Emil Haury was clearly a master teacher and like his father, a dedicated institution builder. But more than anything else, he was one of the preeminent archaeologists of the 20th century. He received many honors, among them the Viking Fund Medal for Archaeology, election to the National Academy of Sciences, the first Arizona faculty member to be so honored, election to the American Philosophical Society, which pleased Emil very much because it was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin for the promotion of useful knowledge. Appointment to the first Riker Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, the university's first endowed chair. The Conservation Service Award of the Department of Interior, one of the very highest awards that is given by the federal government to a civilian. And finally, the Alfred Vincent Kidder Award for Eminence in American Archaeology, which pleased Emil so much because he admired Kidder. No small wonder that when President Richard A. Harville, who admired Emil very much, chose anthropology as one of the two disciplines, the other was astronomy, on which to base his efforts to establish the University of Arizona as a nationally ranked research institution. Well, Emil was a consummate field archaeologist who gained an intimate knowledge of all regions and time periods of southwestern archaeology in a way that no one else, either before or since, has enjoyed. Because he was a skilled observer and had an excellent memory, he was able to use that knowledge to great advantage. While still a graduate student, he proved that the Roman lead artifacts that had been found near Tucson were planted as a hoax. He remembered a potsherd that his parents had picked up at Walnut Canyon in 1908 and preserved in their cabinet of curiosities in their parlor, well enough to identify it within the ceramic system of the Southwest. His store of knowledge about prehistoric pottery in the Southwest was absolutely legendary. He had what many enviously called a feel for ceramic identification. Long after his retirement, his colleagues kept coming to him, bearing some nondescript potsherd that they hoped he would be able to help them with, and they were seldom disappointed. His use of regional distribution, stylistic seriation, stratigraphic control, ceramic cross-dating, and dendrochronology to establish the whole chronology at Snaketown is a classic example of the kind of interpretation that was possible because of his great store of detailed knowledge witnessed firsthand. Emil understood that until some reasonable semblance of chronology was achieved, it was very difficult to undertake cultural interpretations. For example, before the advent of tree ring dating, archaeologists working in the Four Corners region of the Southwest were fully convinced of an enormous antiquity for the basket maker Pueblo sequence that had been developed at that first Pecos conference. Kidder even talked about the cherished but never discovered BC, that is before Christ dates. Well, dendrochronology reduced that presumed great antiquity by more than a half, and instead of placing the basket maker around 2000 BC, put him in the first couple of centuries of the Christian era. This, of course, caused major changes in the efforts to interpret the cultural change and development. Dendrochronology gave southwestern archaeology that precise dating when all other regions of the country lacked, until the advent of radiocarbon dating after World War II. Shortly after World War II, Walter Taylor published a scathing review of the work of 6 of the country's outstanding archaeologists, including Kidder and Haury. He accused them of emphasizing chronological concerns rather than focusing on cultural interpretation. Taylor generated a great deal of ill will that delayed the acceptance of his own more positive ideas about the processes of cultural development. There were, of course, some values in the criticisms they had. And in the 1960s, various approaches were developed to bring more positive ideas about the processes of culture change into archaeological interpretation. Emil, of course, had criticisms many times before. For example, when he promoted the idea of the Magyar culture for the central mountain region of the Southwest. However, he tried very hard not to allow his personal views to contaminate his relationship with people. He tried to treat criticism in a professional manner. He preferred to respond to it by obtaining new evidence rather than by citing ideological or theoretical positions. He made every effort to avoid having professional disagreements affect his personal relationships. I remember being on the edge of a conversation between Emil and Walt, in which Emil suggested that Walt might want to consult with Dick Woodbury on whatever it was they were discussing. Walt replied that he would never talk to Dick Woodbury. When Emil asked why, Walt explained that Woodbury had said some unkind things about him in a review of Taylor's monograph. Emil chuckled and pointed out that Walt had said some unkind things about him in that very monograph, but that it did not prevent him from talking to Walt. The most telling of Woodbury's criticisms was that Taylor ignored the fundamental requirement of archaeology that a firm and fine-grained chronology was a prerequisite to all further interpretation. Now, as I mentioned, there were, of course, some merit in some of Taylor's criticisms. And in the 1960s, various approaches, such as the new archaeology and its processual and behavioral successors, tried to correct for that problem. And when those people wanted to test their ideas, are you surprised that they turned to the rich body of chronological data that had been created by Kidder, Haury, and others in the Southwest, the only place in the country where such information was available? Emil worked in all periods of Southwestern prehistory. He dug mammoth kill sites that documented the hunting activities of Ice Age people. Evidence of which, by the way, is currently on exhibit in the lobby of the Arizona State Museum. He helped to define the Cochise culture which followed it, and demonstrated at Matty Canyon that farming was introduced before pottery. He provided most of the evidence for Gladwin's Hohokam culture, and he forced researchers in the Anasazi or ancestral Pueblo area to define their ideas by introducing the concept of the Magyar as a competing culture. He also stimulated the research on the southward-bound Kayenta diaspora by identifying and excavating the Maverick Mountain occupation at Point of Pines. The chronological framework of Southwestern archaeology was constructed of several shorter segments of the regional sequence. They overlapped and therefore created the whole. It was not, however, until Emil dug Ventana Cave that the entire sequence was found undisturbed in stratigraphic order in one place. Ventana Cave contained evidence of the occupation of entire South Arizona, from the time of the Ice Age hunters to the brief visits of tourists who dropped flashbulbs on the surface. Ventana Cave, therefore, has an absolutely iconic position in American archaeology. Emil contributed a great deal, of course, to Southwestern archaeology, but he fully understood that his legacy would depend not upon his work, but upon that of his students and others. They would be the ones to refine, correct, and expand his conception of the Southwestern past. And they have. For example, by discovering huge villages of pre-ceramic farmers near Tucson, by showing that his belief in considerable antiquity for the early part of the Hohokam sequence was just as erroneous as Kidder's view of the great antiquity for the Basque makers. By reassessing the role of warfare in Southwestern prehistory, and by exploring the influence of climate change in the Hohokam irrigation system by the reconstruction of stream flow from tree ring records. The last of his 30 doctoral students has shown that the unique cylindrical vessels from Chaco Canyon were used for drinking the foaming chocolate of the high civilizations of Mesoamerica to the south. Well, except for 2 Latin American projects, all of Emil's work was carried out here in the Southwest. In 1925, he was with Cummings at Cuicuilco in central Mexico, the very first of his archaeological experiences. And in 1949 and 50, he excavated sites of the little-known Chibcha culture in the country of Colombia in northern South America. And while the family was in Colombia, they stayed in Bogota in a pension. And at that pension, they had an amusing culinary experience. Also there was another American researcher whose wife responded to a request from the owner of the pension about favorite dishes that she enjoyed senos de ternera. Well, the owner, though somewhat surprised, agreed to provide some. And within a few days, she served them some tough and rubbery bits of protein in a cream sauce. The American woman had meant to ask for calf brains, sesos de ternera, because while sesos are brains, senos are breasts. And in the case of the calf, the breast is an udder. Emil's successes in southwestern archaeology are substantial and widely recognized, but much less well known are his important contributions to national policy. Because his archaeological interpretations were well grounded in imperial evidence, untainted by narrow theoretical bias or ideological concerns, it was expected that he would apply the similarly rigorous methods when offering advice on policy matters. Of equal importance was his realization that government officials have to cope with some very difficult issues, such as historical conditions, legislative mandates, bureaucratic problems, personal ambitions, political interference, competing agendas, and pressure groups. Well, he understood that the role of outsiders like himself was to identify the problems and demand solutions, but that lobbying for a particular solution that did not take into account the problems of the specific agency involved were bound to be very counterproductive. This, by the way, again, was the kind of practical approach that Emil admired Benjamin Franklin. Agency heads and political leaders came to him for advice, for they knew that he would offer well-reasoned arguments for what he thought would best serve the needs of the nation. As a key member of the Independent Committee for the Recovery of Archaeological Remains, he was in a position to pressure for action to protect the nation's archaeological heritage. He played an important role in paving the way for the gradual adoption of the environmental and historical legislation that now provides the protection that he possessed. He was especially helpful to the Department of the Interior when it became necessary to restructure the role of the National Park Service as the lead agency for archaeology and historic preservation. Emil contributed significantly to the development of our national program in compliance archaeology that now involves many cities and counties and a great many private companies in the field of cultural resource management. As these changes began to produce results, Emil applied his deep understanding of the political and bureaucratic processes to make the state of Arizona a national leader in cultural resource management and on the way to greatly increase employment opportunities for archaeologists. For example, Emil developed one of the nation's first successful programs in highway salvage archaeology, something that he accomplished with the accidental but critical assistance of a famous Mexican revolutionary, Doroteo Orango, otherwise known as Pancho Villa. When President Woodrow Wilson recognized Villa's rival, Venustiano Carranza, as the legal president of Mexico, Villa began to attack Americans, kill them, and he even invaded Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. Well, President Wilson responded by sending General John J. Pershing and a contingent of the U.S. Army to capture Pancho Villa. But he hampered Pershing by ordering him not to commandeer Mexican railroads for the transportation of troops and supplies. As a result, Pershing was terribly frustrated by the desperate condition of the roads, when there were any, on both sides of the border. He was unable to capture Villa, but fortunately he escaped public embarrassment because he left Mexico shortly after to lead American forces in Europe during World War I. But when he returned to Washington after the war, he decided to address the transportation problems that he and his mules had encountered in Mexico and the Southwest. He assigned the task of designing a national system of military highways to a young lieutenant just out of West Point. That young officer traveled across the country from Maryland to California with a contingent of troops to demonstrate what would happen. It took them 3 months. Well, when that young officer, whose name was Dwight Eisenhower, became the 34th President of the United States, he dusted off that report and sent it to Congress, where it became the Federal Aid Highway and Highway Revenue Act of 1956. Now, we're all familiar with the main result of that act, the interstate highway system, but perhaps less familiar, or less aware at least, that it authorized the use of federal funds for archaeological salvage on federal highway projects. Well, didn't take Emil long to request some of those funds. After all, he had been pressuring the Highway Department, now the Arizona Department of Transportation, for such policy in Arizona since 1938. However, the Highway Department found it very difficult to change rapidly. So Emil and his friends and supporters in the Highway Department had to wait for the Navajo Nation and the National Forest Service to create a crisis for them to resolve. The Navajos and the Forest Service refused to grant rights-of-way across their land for highways unless the project was in compliance with the federal requirements for salvage archaeology. Well, Emil was ready and willing to take care of the crisis if modest funds could be found to help. Now, although there were meetings and memos throughout all of these negotiations, most of the activity was unofficial, informal, and unrecorded. For example, after a meeting on the Navajo Forest Service right-of-way crisis, the head of the planning department of the Highways Department wrote a letter to Emil thanking him for the meeting that they had just had, without mentioning what the meeting was about, and commenting that this was the opening we have been looking for. This turns out to be the Navajo Forest Service crisis. Well, the Highway Department, or the Highway Commission actually, because that meant that it was a little less politically dangerous, the Highway Commission allocated $25,000, discretionary dollars, to prospect for archaeological artifacts in advance of construction, without making any reference to Emil's long-standing request, to the new federal law, to the funding of salvage archaeology, or to the right-of-way matter. Nothing that might turn out to be politically embarrassing later on. Well, the first highway salvage archaeologist was employed, and within a few months, the Highway Department found itself in full compliance with the law, no longer under pressure from Haury, free of any right-of-way crisis, and with a clear precedent for justifying future state funding for salvage archaeology, all at no great cost and without having to suffer any traumatic breaking of comfortable and cherished old bureaucratic habits. Well, Emil devoted his long and productive career to the goal of achieving a better understanding of Southwestern prehistory. He recognized the unity, the diversity, and the regional context of its development. He employed meticulous and systematic field methods, accumulated professionally recovered empirical data, set high standards of performance, nurtured and trained students in a broad institutional framework, and he established both relative and absolute chronologies. The result is the rational, evidence-based, data-rich, chronologically controlled, environmentally sound, and anthropologically grounded concept of the Southwestern past that guides our own efforts to meet his high expectations. In attempting to give you an overall assessment of Emil Haury, I find it helpful to turn to the words of others. For example, when Emil's father died in 1926, his faculty colleague, Peter Wadle, the father of Emil's boyhood friend, Waldo, described Gustav Haury in a brief statement that, with the change of only Bethel for Arizona, describes Emil Haury as well. A keen intellect, sound judgment, a strong but pleasing personality, firm convictions, positively but not dogmatically expressed, wide-reaching and intelligent observation, gave him a breadth of outlook and a sympathetic attitude that made him one of the chief molders of educational policy, not only during his early years at Bethel, Arizona, but throughout his busy lifetime. A fine sense of humor and the ability to tell as well as to appreciate a good story made him an almost ideal companion. However, for a final statement about Emil, I turn to an old Plains Indian Waldo Wadle told me about some years ago. Waldo was a student in a summer program in anthropological field training sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation at the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe in the 30s. A very small group of students, in fact, were being given an opportunity to practice ethnographic field methods by interviewing a blind old Plains Indian. Well, the students started by asking questions about the rules of kinship and marriage, good social anthropologists. Waldo noted that the old man was not entirely happy with this situation, and he thought that it would be better to ask questions about behavior rather than about the rules of behavior. And so he decided that he would ask about the common courtship practice known as lifting the teepee cover. Now, in addition to the familiar slanting exterior cover of the teepee, there is a curtain hanging on the inside that cuts off that awkward space like attics and upper story rooms. And each occupant of the teepee had a designated sleeping area next to that curtain. A young man in pursuit of a young woman would note the location of her sleeping area, lift the teepee cover there after dark, slip into the space between the curtain and the cover in hopes of spending some quality time in her company. So Waldo spoke up. "Sir, did you ever lift the teepee cover?" Well, the old Indian turned to face the sound of Waldo's voice, lifted his cane in the area as if to strike out Waldo, and exclaimed, "Thank God there's a real human being here." So I could summarize by telling you that Emil Haury was a promising young man, a loving husband, a supportive father, a dependable friend, a talented artist and draftsman, a master teacher, a skilled administrator, a successful institution builder, a dedicated public servant, and above all, a preeminent archaeologist. But following Cicero, I will save all of those words for another time, and instead following that wise old Indian, simply tell you that Emil Walter Haury was, in every sense of the phrase, one real human being. And now I invite you to join me in looking forward to the future lectures in this series dedicated to him. They will further unfold the fascinating story of Southwestern archaeology to which he contributed so much. Finally, I cannot resist pointing out some important symbolism. In 1928, one man and two women earned the first master's degrees in archaeology at the University of Arizona. And today, more than 3/4 of a century later, the Western National Parks Association launches a lecture series devoted to that man. Lectures that are being delivered by one man and two women. I also want to invite you on your way out to look at some of the souvenirs of Emil's field equipment that is on exhibit in the back of the room. Thank you for listening.
I'd like to echo the invitation to join us for the next two lectures. We have Barbara Mills coming next week, and the week after that, Carla Van West, traveling from New Mexico. I suspect many of you know both of these individuals, and I know that you'll agree this is going to be a great series. I'd like to issue a challenge as well before we leave tonight. I look around this room, and I'm very heartened to see a few young people here. But you know what? We need to do a lot better job in making sure these stories continue and that we engage young people in the stories that Dr. Thompson just told, that our national parks tell. And so I ask each of you to think about young people that you might invite to the series and to take the national parks. Thank you very much for coming tonight.